I need you to understand something before I show you this, because if I just lead with the trick itself, you're going to think I'm exaggerating and you're going to half commit to the formula and get 60% of the result and then tell someone it didn't work the way I said. So I'm going to give you the proof first. I'm going to give it to you with numbers that cannot be argued with, and then I'm going to give you the complete method, and then I'm going to explain exactly why a state fisheries board in the American South added language to its shoreline fishing regulations in 2017 that was specifically crafted, without any public explanation, to prohibit what I'm about to show you. Same shoreline, same lake in western Tennessee, same Tuesday morning in early April, water temperature 59 degrees, same overcast conditions, same light southeast wind at about 6 miles per hour. Two fishermen positioned 40 yards apart on the same continuous bank with no structural difference between their sections, confirmed by both of them wading the stretch the afternoon before and mapping it. One of them is using a standard bottom rig with night crawlers from a bait shop, the most commonly recommended setup for that specific fishery according to every local fishing report published in the previous 60 days. The other one is using the same night crawlers, the exact same night crawlers from the same container purchased at the same bait shop that morning. But he has prepared his shoreline using a method I'm going to show you step by step, and his bait is sitting in a zone that he has been conditioning since he arrived. At the 2-hour mark, the first fisherman has 4 bites and 2 fish. The second fisherman has 31 bites and 19 fish. At the 4-hour mark, the first fisherman has 9 bites and 5 fish. The second fisherman has lost count of his bites. I am not being dramatic about that. He actually stopped marking them because he ran out of space in the column he'd set up in his notebook, and he has landed 44 fish. 5 against 44. Same lake, same bank, same bait, same morning. The only variable was the shoreline preparation method, and what I'm describing as a shoreline preparation method cost this man approximately 60 cents in materials and about 12 minutes of setup time when he arrived at the water. Now, before you locate the alternative explanation your brain is already reaching for, let me give you the follow-up data, because I anticipated that reaction and I built it into the test design. At the 4-hour mark, both fishermen switched sections. The man who had been running the standard rig moved into the prepared zone. The man who had been running the prepared zone moved into the standard section. They both continued fishing with identical rigs and identical bait for another 2 hours. In the prepared zone, the man who had previously been catching 5 fish in 4 hours caught 26 fish in 2 hours. In the standard section, the man who had previously been catching 44 fish in 4 hours caught 3 fish in 2 hours. The zone transferred. The preparation outlasted the original fisherman by over 2 hours of active fishing. The fish were not responding to the person. They were not responding to the technique. They were responding to what had been done to that specific section of shoreline, and they kept responding to it long after the person who did it had left. That is what 100 yards of fish attraction looks like in a controlled setting. And that is why a state fisheries board added regulatory language that nobody in the public fishing community was ever given a clear explanation for. Now, I want to tell you the story behind that regulation, because understanding it is how you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here and why this knowledge has been so systematically kept out of every fishing magazine, every YouTube channel, every tackle shop conversation for as long as most of the people watching this have been alive. In the summer of 2016, a fishing access point on a popular reservoir in western Tennessee began generating complaints. The complaints were not about litter or noise or parking. The complaints were from other fishermen about one specific angler who was consistently clearing the fish from a section of bank and making it essentially unproductive for anyone who arrived after him for a window of several hours. Multiple people filed reports with the State Wildlife Resources Agency describing what they characterized as an unfair method that was monopolizing fish from a public access point. The agency sent an officer to observe. The officer watched this angler on 3 separate occasions over the course of about 6 weeks and documented his setup, his methodology, and his catch. What the officer observed was completely legal under every regulation that existed at that time. No nets, no traps, no prohibited substances, no illegal species, legal gear, legal bait, and a preparation routine that the officer described in his filed report as a shoreline conditioning process using natural organic materials applied to the bank and shallow water in a pattern consistent with historic folk fishing practices documented in the region. That phrase, historic folk fishing practices, is in the actual filed report. I have read it. The agency forwarded the documentation to its regulatory division, and in March of 2017, the state published updated shoreline fishing regulations that included new language prohibiting the use of organic attractant preparations applied directly to bank or nearshore substrate prior to fishing. No public comment period. No announcement to fishing clubs or associations. No explanation in the regulatory summary beyond a generic reference to maintaining equitable access to public fishing resources. The man who had been using the method found out about the regulation change through a friend who happened to read the full regulatory update. He stopped using it on that water. He still uses it on private ponds and on waters in states where the regulation does not exist. I spoke with him for over 2 hours at a boat ramp in Humphreys County, and he told me everything. And the reason he told me everything is the same reason the man from Decatur told me everything about the tournament ban. Because both of them are tired of watching this knowledge die in a regulatory structure that was built to protect it from becoming common. Here is exactly what they have been doing, and here is exactly how you do it. Now, I'm going to show you precisely how this shoreline preparation works, and I need you to understand that this is a 2-component system, meaning there is a water application and a bank application, and both of them matter, and skipping one reduces your effectiveness by more than half. Start with the water component, because you deploy it first, and it needs about 20 minutes to establish a scent column before you start fishing. You need fermented grain. Specifically, you need to take 2 cups of cracked corn or whole kernel field corn and soak it in water for a minimum of 4 days before your fishing trip, sealed in a plastic container at room temperature. By day 4, it will smell strongly sour and slightly alcoholic. That fermentation is exactly what you want. Do not use fresh corn. Do not use canned corn. The fermentation process produces lactic acid and a suite of volatile organic compounds that disperse through water in a way that raw corn simply does not. And those compounds are the primary long-distance signal that pulls fish toward your zone from distance. If you're reading 100 yards in the title and thinking that sounds impossible, the fermented grain water component is how it happens, because the volatile compounds from active lacto-fermentation in water have a documented dispersion radius in still to slow-moving fresh water. That is genuinely in that range under the right conditions, specifically in cool water, with minimal wind chop on the surface, which is exactly the condition that early morning shoreline fishing most commonly presents. When you arrive at the water, before you set up your rod, you take approximately half a cup of the fermented corn liquid, not the solids yet, just the liquid, strained through a cloth or paper towel, and you pour it slowly into the water at the upstream or upwind edge of your intended fishing zone. Pour it in a thin stream over about 30 seconds so it disperses as it enters rather than dropping as a concentrated mass. You want it to begin drifting through your zone as a diluted continuous signal, not a single concentrated point source. Now set up your rod and wait. The 20-minute establishment window is real and it matters. Fish responding to the initial scent column will begin orienting toward your zone during that window. And if you start casting immediately, you will spook the first wave of responders before they consolidate. This is the single most common mistake people make with this method, and it is the difference between good results and the results I described in the first test I told you about. After 20 minutes, introduce the bank component. Take the fermented corn solids, the actual kernels, and press a small amount, about 2 tablespoons, into the mud or substrate at the water's edge directly in front of your casting zone, roughly at the waterline where wave action or gentle current will continue to slowly dissolve and carry material into the water. This creates a secondary sustained release source that maintains the scent column for hours after the initial liquid application has dispersed. The solids dissolve slowly and continuously, and they also function as a visual feeding cue in shallow water that increases the competitive urgency of fish already in your zone. Now here is the enhancement that takes this system from very effective to the kind of effective that generates regulatory responses. Into your remaining fermented corn liquid, add 2 tablespoons of the same sardine oil preparation I've described in other videos, specifically the allicin bonded sardine oil that results from mixing garlic powder into cheap sardine packing oil and allowing it to rest for 1 hour before combining with anise extract. You don't need much. 2 tablespoons of this into your liquid applicator before the initial pour. What this does is layer a predatory feeding trigger on top of the prey congregation signal that the fermented grain is already broadcasting. The fermented grain pulls fish in because it mimics the smell of a productive feeding area, a place where organic material has been breaking down and small invertebrates and forage have been congregating. The sardine allicin compound then activates the predatory strike reflex in every fish that enters the zone. You are not just attracting fish. You are attracting fish and then triggering them. The combination is why that second fisherman stopped counting his bites. Apply your bait normally, cast to the center of your prepared zone, and fish it. Reintroduce a small amount of fermented liquid, about 2 tablespoons, every 45 minutes to maintain the signal strength. Do not over-apply. More is not better here. The goal is a consistent low-level signal, not a concentration spike that causes fish to become cautious rather than aggressive. Now let me explain the biology behind why this works at a level that will make you completely unable to look at a bottle of commercial fish attractant the same way again. Freshwater fish, and I am talking about every common species you are likely to be targeting from a shoreline: bass, crappie, catfish, bluegill, carp, walleye, all of them, navigate their environment primarily through chemosensory information. They are reading the water the way you read a room when you walk in and immediately know whether food is being cooked or whether something is burning or whether someone is wearing too much cologne. Except their ability to make that read is so dramatically more sensitive than your olfactory system that the comparison almost doesn't work. A common carp, which is one of the most studied species in fisheries olfaction research, can detect amino acid concentrations in water at levels below 1 part per 10 billion. Let me give you a reference for that number. If you took a single grain of table salt, dissolved it in water, and then diluted that water into a volume equivalent to 25 Olympic swimming pools, a carp would detect the presence of that salt at the far end of the last pool. This is not theoretical. This is measured, published, replicated science from university fisheries biology programs in Europe and North America going back to the 1960s. And it is the factual foundation for understanding why a preparation you deploy at the shoreline can pull fish from 100 yards away in favorable water conditions. The fermented grain liquid works because the lactic acid fermentation process produces L-serine, L-alanine, and a suite of short-chain fatty acid volatiles that are chemically identical to the compounds produced by dense concentrations of aquatic invertebrates and decomposing organic matter in natural feeding areas. When fish detect these compounds in the water column, the neurological response is oriented movement toward the source. This is not a decision. This is a tropism, a directed biological response as automatic as the way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before your brain has consciously registered the heat. Fish that are 100 yards from your shoreline and encounter the edge of your scent column do not decide to swim toward it. They simply begin swimming toward it because their nervous system has interpreted the chemical signal as pointing to a feeding opportunity and has redirected their movement accordingly. The sardine allicin layer that you introduce into the preparation operates through a completely separate receptor pathway. Where the fermented grain signal says there is food in this direction, the injured prey fatty acid profile in the sardine oil says there is an active predatory feeding event happening right now, and competitive access to that prey is time-limited. These two signals together do not add, they multiply, because the first signal brings fish into the zone and the second signal puts those fish into an aggressive competitive feeding state. And a fish in an aggressive competitive feeding state does not cautiously inspect your bait. It strikes every time. This is why the test produced the results it did, and this is why the zone effect persisted after the original fisherman left, because the bank substrate preparation continued releasing both signal types into the water column from the dissolved fermented corn solids at the waterline, and fish continued responding to those signals regardless of whether any human being was standing there or not. The zone was fishing itself. Now here is what the commercial industry does not want this information to do, which is reach the kind of scale where it becomes common knowledge, because the moment this becomes common knowledge, a specific and very profitable problem emerges for the companies that sell you shoreline fishing products. Their entire product line is built around the premise that fish attraction is a function of what is on your bait at the moment it enters the water. Single-point delivery of scent compound directly from lure or bait surface. That model exists not because it is the most effective approach to attracting fish, but because it is the only approach that can be packaged and sold in a retail container at a margin that justifies shelf space in a major sporting goods chain. A fermented grain preparation cannot be sold in a bottle. It has to be made fresh, it has to be used within a specific window of fermentation activity, it cannot be stabilized for distribution, and it costs less than $1 per session to produce at home. There is no product to sell you. There is no endorsement deal for a professional angler to promote it. There is no display placement fee for a retailer to stock it. The entire economic infrastructure of commercial shoreline fishing attractants depends on you not knowing that the most effective fish attraction method available requires nothing from a store. The regulatory language added in 2017 didn't emerge from a conservation concern. It emerged because a public access point was demonstrating visibly and repeatedly that one person with 60 cents worth of fermented grain was outfishing every other angler on that bank by a margin that made the premise of commercial attractant products look absurd. The regulation didn't protect the fish. It protected the market. And the men who figured this out, the ones who have been using fermented grain preparations on private ponds and exempt waters and the rivers and bayous of the American South since before anyone currently watching this was born, those men are getting older, and the knowledge transfer has been slow and incomplete and deliberately discouraged by every commercial and regulatory force that profits from you not having it. A man in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, told me his grandfather used fermented corn and wild onion preparations on the banks of Oxbow Lakes in the 1930s that he described as making the water alive with fish inside of an hour. A retired commercial fisherman from the Illinois River told me that the guides who ran successful fish camps on the river in the 50s and 60s all had their own versions of bank preparation formulas that they guarded like property and passed on only to family. A woman in Hardin County, Tennessee, whose father ran a fishing guide service for 22 years, told me he had a preparation notebook that he kept in a lockbox, and that she has never shown anyone because she wasn't sure what it was worth. That notebook contains, by her description, 17 different bank and water preparation formulas organized by species, season, and water type. 17 formulas, developed over 22 years of professional guiding on productive Tennessee waters, sitting in a lockbox. Because the knowledge infrastructure for passing this information forward has never existed, and the industry that would have been the natural vehicle for distributing it had every financial reason to ensure it never did. I want to be part of building that infrastructure, the complete system, every seasonal variation, every species-specific modification, the winter preparation adjustments for cold water conditions where fermentation behaves differently, the moving water adaptations for river and stream shoreline fishing, the saltwater versions that use different fermentation substrates for different target species. Every formula I've been able to document from traditional practitioners across 18 states and 4 decades of recorded practice, all of it is in the resource linked below this video. But what I just gave you works. It works this weekend. It works at any public shoreline that does not have the specific regulatory prohibition I described. And if you are in a state where that prohibition exists, you already know who to be angry at and why. Fermented corn liquid, 4 days minimum, half cup into the zone, 20 minutes before your first cast. Solids pressed into the bank substrate at the waterline. Sardine allicin enhancement optional but strongly recommended. Reapply liquid every 45 minutes. That is the system. Subscribe because there is more of this, and it gets deeper. And share this with the fishermen in your life who have been standing on empty banks wondering why the person 30 yards away keeps pulling fish. And they can't buy a bite. The answer has never been luck. It has never been skill. It has always been knowledge. And now you have it.